Hi, everyone. I'm Harry Halpin. I'm the host of this panel, and this panel is on resisting cybercolonialism and authoritarianism with privacy technology, hosted by NIM Technologies. And I'm happy to be the moderator. Today, our panel will feature myself, Roberto Milcheto, who's a famous Brazilian open source developer, Ines Benguirat from Tunisia, and now a PhD student at KU Leuven studying privacy enhancing technologies with Claudia Diaz, and Alexis Rousseau, who's the chief operating officer and Bitcoin pioneer in Switzerland. And finally, and last but not least, Renato Villa from the Progressive International and a well-known human rights lawyer. So I'm just going to open the stage, and everyone's going to go around and give a quick introduction into how what they believe is the current problem with cybercolonialism. But I want to point out that this panel was inspired by a 2014 blog post, post-Snowden, by George Denises, formerly a professor at University College London, then co-founder of NIM, working in privacy technology, and then now currently working for Mark Zuckerberg, building Facebook Libra. So before he turned to the dark side of the force, George penned this very interesting essay where he points out that cybercolonialism, he says, is the policy or practice of acquiring full or partial political control over another country's cyberspace, occupying it with technologies or components, serving foreign interests, and exploiting it economically. And the point that George was trying to make is that what people saw with the pervasive surveillance revelations of Snowden, including how they were using Google and GCHQ to basically tap the internet connections of countries such as Germany and other countries, is that this was essentially a new form of information colonialism, or perhaps we want to say even imperialism, and that this was very dangerous. And the question is, how would you as a country or people or social movement react to this kind of new pervasive surveillance from essentially foreign and hostile powers? And foreign countries and social movements have a problem. Even if I'm, let's say, a protester from Tunisia to South America to the United States with Black Lives Matter, we are still ultimately dependent on devices such as Google devices or Apple devices or Facebook or Twitter, which are inherently controlled by particular countries and under particular legal jurisdictions like the United States jurisdiction of the United States, and that these jurisdictions could turn this technology against you. But on the other hand, there's not many options. So some countries like China have developed their own cyber infrastructure, but essentially, if you're a smaller country, you have to choose. Do I want to, like, if I'm Saudi Arabia, I ally with the US. If I'm Iran, do I work with China? Do I work with Russia? Whose surveillance technology do I buy? And this has created a sort of surveillance arms race, backdoor arms race, where I think all nation states are equally guilty of imperialist and colonialist practices, not just over personal data, but over critical national infrastructure. And I think now, well, George's question essay points out, I think, the problem. What we're hoping to get at this panel is also some possible solutions, some possible tools and methods and weapons to fight back against this new phase of imperialism. So with that, I would like to hand over to Roberto to talk about the situation in South America. Roberto?
Thank you, Harry. Hi, my name is Roberto. I'm a programmer. And well, I share this code because I've been there in those years in the beginning of my career. And I remember this vividly, that it's from Iban Manglin, the lawyer from the Free Software Foundation. He said, like, this week in Brazil, this was around 2001, right? The chief technology officer of Microsoft Corporation, Craig Mundy, make a public speech in which he said that my client, the Free Software Foundation, and only this Free Software Foundation, was destroying the global software industry. And this was a joke back in those days. It still sounds like a really bad one to me. And I've been asked from my friend Harry to come here and talk a little bit about the free and the open source movements in Brazil specifically. And I was looking around Wikipedia because this was my life among my friends. But before I even start using Linux, I researched it, and the Wikipedia told me that in 1993, someone on the University of São Paulo installed the first Linux in the country, and which brings to what I call a new society of enthusiasts of open source software that created several Linux user groups around the country. And one thing to another, Brazilians, they know how to make a party, right? So we created, I think it's the biggest conference in person about open source in Brazil, in south of Brazil, and it was called the Fórum Internacional de Software Livre. And since 2000, if I'm not wrong, and those are movements that helped a lot of people to start in computing, to start learning about software, to not to use, pirate software, because Windows was a paid software, compilers was paid software. And in order to learn, you have to buy the software, very expensive software just to learn. It's very hard to create a culture, to innovate, to give freedom to people, right? So around 2003, this movement that, by the way, a lot of companies was starting in Brazil around those days, to work specifically focused on Linux and open source, which employed a lot of people as well. And in 2003, the movement managed to get a law released that obligated every government entity, if they need a software, it should be an open source software. And it doesn't mean that nobody have to pay nothing. No, actually, you still have to train the people to develop the software and to maintain the software. But it means that everyone knows what is running there, and everyone can work on that thing because that thing matters, right? Unfortunately, the sad news to us is that today, a couple months ago, in the middle of this pandemic, right, they canceled this law. So they created again what we call, and the CTO of Microsoft in those days loved it, which is the request for quotes. And this opened doors to a lot of corruption, as we all see specifically in South America. And the same movement I'm seeing since Bitcoin started to appear in Brazil. Brazil have this very weird hidden capital control. And just to give an example, I was born in 1984, and I've seen 7 chains of currency in my country. So 7 times they changed the currency. And if I tell you that from the 80s to today, we had an inflation in Brazil from the maximum to the minimum from 6,000% to 1%. This is like ripping off and controlling people, right? And when Bitcoin got there, of course, it get very popular. A lot of people use Bitcoin. There's a strong community of Bitcoiners in Brazil, a lot of exchanges, a lot of exciting companies, and a lot of people in the market using. And now the government is coming to answer to the innovation with something that they call open banking, but that is going to give everyone a platform to be part of the financial system. And I want to point out that the Brazil have the most excluded financial system. We have a lot of people excluded from the financial system, even having, since 2001, one of the most innovative technological infrastructure, the financial system. We have, since 2001, directly debits, and we can send money to each other electronically, which is pretty new nowadays, and which is very new with Bitcoin, right? But all of it came with a cost. The cost is the control. So when we are talking about open banking, we are talking about to more control, because Brazil, believe it or not, have 12% of interest on the credit card and the money you get from the bank, not yearly, monthly. So 12% monthly, it's crazy, right? So when we see Bitcoin coming and people start getting aware of it, and this is an option to not to use this kind of system, node system, the response to it is let's regulate, and everyone else in Brazil have to declare any transactions that they made, even if the transactions never touch any kind of real fiat money over the country. So as we can see, if we maintain the open source spirit alive, probably we can beat the monster and move the humanity to a common collective global goal, right? A free, better, and fair life full of opportunities to everyone, where the knowledge is available and abundant to all. That's my point. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much, Roberto. I think it's an interesting point of trying to figure out if indeed Bitcoin, what the role of Bitcoin is in fighting for some sort of financial independence, and how financial independence is an important way to declare your digital autonomy. And on that topic, moving to more social critique level, Anes Benguirat from Tunisia. Anes, could you start?
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you just fine.
Okay, cool. So cybercolonialism is like any problem in the world. Like the climate change or economical problems hits the global south harder, right? Maybe not Corona. Corona is a weird like crisis that we've been dealing with, but usually whenever there is a problem, it hits and this is due to a lot of factors. There is authoritarian regimes, bad policy done by governments like Tunisia or the entire Middle East, but this is also a direct problem, a direct consequence from imperialism. And one impact that I actually would like to talk in these like 5 or 10 minutes is the immigration of Aichi workers. Even though like there is this story whenever we think about immigration, there is all these poor people that go over the sea with a boat, they're poor, and going to the West is their only solution from running away from war or from famine. This is actually not the case in IT workers. At least in Tunisia, if you have a degree in IT, finding a job is actually very easy. However, do we stay in Tunisia as IT, as engineers? Actually not. I studied in Tunisia, and in my class we were 80 students, I think. Only 5 of them are actually now in Tunisia. We all went either to France or Germany or Canada. And this is due to a lot of problems. If you have a startup in Tunisia, how can you actually compete with the salaries given by French companies or Google or Facebook? But the money is not the only issue. There is other issues when we talk about foreign investors coming from the West to the global South. We think, oh, it's great. They're going to pay taxes. They're going to hire people. But the problem is like these engineers, they're actually enslaved. And this is the same enslavement as we hear about, oh, Zara and H&M, they go to poor Bangladesh, they enslave like 12-year-old children. Engineers in Tunisia, in the Middle East or in Africa, they're actually dealing with the same enslavement. Another problem which can be maybe the problem of Tunisia, for example, there is this deal that the Tunisian government did with the foreign countries. If you want to have an offshore company, which means you have a headquarter in the West country, and you want to have like open it in Tunisia, you get 10 years of tax free. This sounds great because, oh, it will create job opportunities because on the future you will pay more taxes to the government. But what actually happened on the practical, these companies, they go to Tunisia, stay 10 years, and then they declare bankruptcy. None of the engineers are being paid after that. And then they eventually run away and maybe they come back and open another company. Another problem I would like to mention, and I would like to move on, is like the enslavement of, like in terms of feminism, in terms of in terms of in terms of unions, even though in Tunisia we have like really strong, like at least syndicates and left student union, but they actually really weak in terms of IT. Maybe because it's a new issue, maybe because cyber colonialism is actually didn't hit when there was like really strong social movements, but now it's actually very strong problem that we need to deal with. So one of the things we did when I was in university, at least in the left student union, is we tried to organize in the engineering school. Because we think, well, I'm from engineering school, so it's easier for me. Which is more important is actually the number of engineers in IT. They actually is way smaller than the number of workers. For example, recently we had a big strike in the south of Tunisia in terms of oil, or even the problems with Tunisia Telecom, which is the main national internet company in Tunisia. And if you look at the numbers, there is for one engineer, there are usually 20 or 30 workers. If these people they get organized, that we actually can create a change. And definitely, the more important thing is actually engineers that can control the means of production. They don't own it, but they can control it in terms of if we want to stop like working for one day or for 1 month, that actually can stop the entire, and then we can create a change. So to just like close this like 5 minutes talk, we published one piece that engineers of the world unite, and this is we want to talk about. We wanted to emphasize that actually the immigration, even though we look at it as like, oh, we go to France, we will be paid more, but actually most immigrants, they actually would like to go back to their countries. They actually have a story, they have life, they have families, they have their cultures, and money, yes, can be a reason why we leave, but actually if we have a more ecosystem that actually can help us to enable social impact and social change, we would like to go back, and we would like to have create a parallel world to this Google and Facebook and Apple, this imperialism that created this enslavement in the IT world.
So thank you very much, Ines. That was a great talk, and I think you've shown that, we started discussing what is cybercolonialism, and then Roberto brought up how it's not just communication, but also the financial tools that people use, and now we also are starting to understand that's actually the workers, including the immigrant workers and the students, and where they end up working and who they end up working for, and why can't they work to better their lives of their own people and control their own means of production. Next, we're going to talk to Alexi. Could you turn your screen on, Alexi? And he will discuss his notions of digital rights in a way to maybe a theoretical framework for understanding how we can correct some of these problems that have been brought up by Ines and Roberto and George.
Yeah, hi, thank you. So I'm a lawyer. That's my initial background, and so I've been studying how law and society and computer science are coming together, especially how governments have been using tech to do stuff, and the main problem that they were always using the tech for their own good, their own institutions' goods, and not for the good of the people, which led me to start thinking about how we can give back some of the power, and this is open source is one way of doing it, and there's a lot of technical things we can do it, but there was a search in Europe about digital rights for people, to give kind of support and to allow people to free themselves from big US corporation, or from European governments that were putting also surveillance, which also are a threat to the individuals in terms of their digital autonomy. And so there's a construct now that it is appearing, is that we see, we try to define how the person is protected, and we see that in the US, data is basically a property. It's something you can take, you can own, you can do whatever you want. So this is a great tool for the US companies to impose cybercolonialism around the world, because they can just get any data and claim it's theirs. And that's a very strong tool they have. On the other side, you have China, which has a different approach. which is a different type of threats, but they claim basically that data, personal data, is part of the common good, and it's owned by the state, by everyone, and then of course it has to be managed and surveilled by the state. And then you don't possess as an individual, you don't have any digital individuality. And in Europe, I'm pushing for a new form, which is say, well, actually, and there's already some data protection authorities which have already started working on this side too, is to say, well, data is part of the human being. Data is part of the human being, and it's a new extension of the human being who has a digital life. And in this digital life, the person needs to be autonomous. You need to have your free will. You need to be free to move, to decide, to choose, to get the right data, to choose your tools, and to disclose whatever you need to disclose whenever you want to. And this is important because this is how your free will, how you make your life, how you make your choices, that will be determined by what kind of information you can have, and what are the tools, and how much you're educated, and so on. So being autonomous, being free, needs to be cherished and needs to be protected somehow. And this is great because we already went through the same process, getting out of the royal system with serf, where you had people were owned by land and were owned by the master. And we went out of this by saying something very simple. We said, well, everyone has to be autonomous. Everyone has the right to life. And then everyone needs to be protected in his physical and mental integrity. You're not supposed to hurt someone or to brainwash someone, because then the person is not free anymore. So we're going now to extend this in a digital form. So you have a digital life and you have a digital autonomy, and actually the digital autonomy is already something which has been in Germany has been already declared as a fundamental right. And because you have this digital life, we're going to extend the protection of your physical integrity and your mental integrity to your digital integrity. And the data, the personal data, which represent your digital life, it's not just an object that you can be bought by a company or is part of the common good. It's actually part of yourself, part of your body, and you cannot give it away. You cannot remove your rights. The rights that you have there are inalienable, so you cannot remove them. So basically, they're a bit like organs. So how do we enforce this legally? And so it's pretty easy, because the right to life is already enshrined into constitutions or into the fundamental European rights, fundamental rights European Charter. And there are a lot of constitutions around the world which have this right to life as a main paragraph. In there is the right to have your physical integrity and your mental integrity protected. And we can simply add digital integrity. So I put two examples. The work has begun in Switzerland, where in two local constitutions, Switzerland is a federal state, so we have like local constitution, and there is already two proposals, one in Valais and one in Geneva state, to add this to the constitution. And I'm also working on the European side to add this on the European Charter. So how does this what is the link with the tool? So once you have this concept of I'm a free person, which is autonomous in my movement, and I have this right, I have subsequent rights. And one of those rights is the right to use cryptography, is the right to use any tool that will bring me anonymity, and I will be using networks. I will be using public spaces, which allows me to be free. And these are peer-to-peer networks. These are financial tools like Bitcoin. These are mixed nets. So I'm working also with Harry on a mixed net, which has the specifics that when you want to communicate with someone, you have the certainty that only the data that you want to give to the other person is actually going through the other person, and no one is able to watch through a mixing, through an onion system. No one is able to actually correlate and try to see who's talking to who. So, and then it's up to you as an individual, as a free person, to decide what you're saying to the other, and also what are you disclosing to the public, to the public. Do you want your state to know something? It's up to you to declare it, and it's not for the state to impose this to you. And so when we're doing this, I think this approach, if it's taken by a country, and even like smaller countries, it's a way to to emancipate all the individuals. And by this, we have a chance, basically, starting from the individuals being emancipated, it forces us to provide education on them, like a good education on what is on applied cryptography. How do you sign document? How do you encrypt things? What is a peer-to-peer network? How do you move on the internet? And doing things and teaching this to kids, basically, so that they are becoming people who are free. And once they are free, now we have also an economy, we have business type, we have blockchain, a blockchain industry, which allows us to create new types of business model, which are respectful for the autonomy, the free will of the people. And then I think we have a big chance there to create something which can actually defeat cybercolonialism. Thank you.
Thank you, Alexei. So I think you brought up the fact that, we can have these new kinds of rights, including effectively these rights of human freedom and digital integrity, which are inherently bound together. And we may need new kinds of software, privacy enhancing technology software, of which Ines and yourself and myself and Roberta and everyone here is working on, in order to be concrete tools in order to create new kinds of emancipation and liberation for the digital era. And on that note, we're going to move over to Renata, who will speak to us on whatever she wants. Renata? Sorry. It appears perhaps Renata has dropped off. She was having some problems earlier. So what we'll do is we'll let her come back on whenever she can. But in the meantime, we'll just take questions from the audience. So let's see. So we had some question, I think, aimed at Alexei, if I remember correctly, about digital autonomy was recognized in Germany in a court decision. Do you know anything about that? Or has there been any kind of digital, what is the current, I think she may think Switzerland, but maybe something happened in Germany. Can you explain?
Let me find the link, but it's digitale Selbstbestimmung, if the person who asked the question understand this. Digitale Selbstbestimmung, and there's also like a form of integrity of the systems, which also has been but I will try to put a link to see, to be sure.
Okay, so I will ask some questions if there are none from the audience real quick. So Ines, you mentioned that engineers of the world should unite, and that currently they are not, engineers and technical staff is not a major focus of organization right now. What kinds of, are you imagining that the engineers will form a new kind of union? Are you looking at some of the things that have happened in Silicon Valley? Are there any particular struggles that you see engineers engaging in order to help people retain autonomy? And maybe you could also speak about how are any engineers in Tunisia or other places working on technologies for privacy or fighting for freedom in some other sense? So just go from there.
So I'd like to add, like, why did we write this piece of Engineers of the World Unite? Historically, when people are trying to organize, they actually need to meet or go to factories and do some meetings and organize a movement, right? And why are we thinking about engineers of the world unite? Because it's actually, as I said, they actually can control the means of production, and the number is smaller, which therefore it makes it easier. And now we have a really big power, which is the internet, which is also free. We don't need as many resources as we used to in the past of like, oh, transportation and go into the factory. As we see it in Tunisia, there is a factory of mines in the south. How can we get there? Talking to the people. But now, even though the internet is actually like we would like to be for the internet to be as accessible as the ideal world, as accessible for anyone. However, it's not the case, at least again in the global south. But when you take a group, when you take the group of engineers, for example, they all have access to the internet, and we've seen in a lot of countries, especially like for example Brazil or Tunisia, for example, with the recent elections that we have, the classical resources that we used to rely on of like foreign funding, of parties working together, they get funding from other countries. Now they actually have less importance than the importance of the internet, where they actually can talk with each other. What is the problem? Well, the problem is we cannot rely on Facebook and on Google, and especially that, for example, again, like in Tunisia and revolution, yes, Facebook did not try to give up the names of the people, but we cannot rely on Facebook forever. One day, Facebook will be contacted by the Tunisian government, and they actually can give up the name of the activist or the name of the left student union organizer. So we need to have more like privacy enhancing technology using this power of the internet to organize. In this privacy enhancing technology is the second, say like the second element of this power of the internet that will the engineers will be using. Do I know some engineers working on privacy enhancing technologies in Tunisia? Maybe a few, not that I am aware of, because of the currency control. It's actually very hard in Tunisia and other countries, as Roberto said, that to have access to, like for example, money transfers. We've seen this problem, for example, when startups, they want to, even small things, like they want to host their website in another DNS, and they actually cannot pay for it, and it's actually a serious problem. So technologies like, for example, what Nim and Alexei and Harry Halpin are working on is going to be very useful. And this is why I want to ask a question: how are you guys will make sure that these technology will be accessible from countries that they actually have really strict currency controls? We've seen a lot of VPNs that they are open source, but somehow we still do need resources, but somehow they're not accessible, even though the fees can be like very minimum, can be $1 a month, but still somehow we're unable, it's not the amount, but we're unable to do so. So how are you guys make sure that these technology will be accessible in the global south?
So I think we should answer that question before going to Renato, who's come back. So either Alexei or Roberto, do you want to discuss how technologies such as the NIM mixnet or Bitcoin in general, these technologies which are about financial inclusion, can actually be used not just by, you know, rich Silicon Valley people, but also by people in the global south? Any people in process of revolutionary struggle, in particular, with possibly against currency controls. Roberto, maybe you want to answer that?
Yeah, of course. I want to Renata to speak, but addressing directly, like for example, me, I live going from country to country. Harry knows this, Alexis, sometimes I'm there, I'm here. And I had a lot of difficulties moving money from traditional banks working in all those companies around the world, and which take months, several months sometimes to get the money. As an example, recently in Brazil, one bank, particular bank, rip off a donation from someone because the amount that was sent as a donation didn't cover the agreement and fee to do foreign exchange, which is amazing, right? A bank doing this. It's like, where are you living? So Bitcoin and give us an option, and an option in the reality, not this whole bubble and 20th century slavery.
Yeah, let me add, we have to be careful. It is an option, but we have to see it's an expensive option right now. It's true if you look at the reality is still the wealthy country which is using these kind of technology, because we have more money to spend on material, because we have also time to invest into thinking all of this. And but because we have time, we have also time to develop and to bring down the cost of price and the cost of the networks and the cost of the device. Everything can go down, and those tools, and then you have the power of the peer-to-peer network that kicks in, that allows ideally a kid who has a phone or who has a simple device connected to the internet anywhere in the world would have the peer-to-peer tools and access to global financial system and global privacy networks and so on. So the potential is there, but we really, there's a lot of work to bring it still.
Yeah. I just want to add the open source computer. Do you remember OLPC was developed in South America, in Brazil? Being Brazil was a huge player without all the money to learn, invest, and etc. I think cryptography after Bitcoin, that had such huge amount of money coming into people stud and being able to create things like NIM credentials, all those stuff that we are working on. Those are going to be the tools that we need to protect ourselves, because those are not tools that you can just buy, right?
Renata is trying to get back in, but in the meantime, we have a question from the audience, which I think is aimed at Ines, perhaps most effectively. It says, how to create our own digital sovereignty when tech jobs are very precarized in NGOs and human rights work. So the only job available are in civil society and these kind of, I would say, digital rights organizations. And she says digital labor is most of the time outsourced at the most cheap rate available. So Ines, could you address that?
I mean, when you look at the reality, it is actually true. It's a complicated question. However, what I like when we wrote this piece of Engineers of the World Unite, we would like to focus on not the money, but the impact of the changes we can create. On the short term, yes, we can argue that we're going to have less money, but on the long term, the money is not actually the value that humans need in their lives. Again, like when immigrants, IT workers, they go to France or Germany and they get paid 10th the salary they can get in Tunisia. After certain years, they're actually tired of this and they would like to go back to their countries. However, the problem, yes, in Tunisia, there's other problems that can stop them from going back, but the fact that an engineer who's willing to give up his big salary to go back to his country is actually a sign that at the end of the day, a human needs more than just money, needs to be in a very equal ecosystem surrounded by his family, his culture, but most importantly that he can make a change. So I think in terms of the labor, we should not focus on the salary and the material. We should focus on the impact that we can create, and eventually, just like we saw with Bitcoin was created from nothing but now has a huge value. So eventually when we create this ecosystem of the focus is not the salary, is not the money, eventually we will have better lives and we will create more job opportunities. So I don't think in the short term there is an answer, but I do think we should work now to better to make the future better on the long term.
Okay, thank you for the answer. And I think that's a very excellent addressing of the issue. And Renata, I believe, is back. So Renata, if you could just give your thoughts on cybercolonialism and privacy enhanced technologies.
Yeah, finally, I want just to jump into the solutions because I know that we are heading to the end of this talk. And a reflection is as early as the 2003-2004, Venezuela, Brazil, and Ecuador had comprehensive laws regulating not only the funding of technology, but the standards that technology for the private sector should have. And at that time, as early as then, we had privacy by default, we had open source by default, and we had ministries in charge of it. And I think that we haven't headed into that direction for a long time. And even in Europe, you like reliable funding, massive adoption, and public interest standards and technology that we have now is concentration of power and a silly mentality that we cannot live without the Silicon Valley tools. And I think that we could completely live without social media, for example. Is not something that's basic and necessary, and on the contrary, it had disrupted many good things that we had before. And we have neglected basic pieces of infrastructure that is one of them, which is precisely what NIM is trying to fix. We have innovated very, very little on the physical layers and technical layers that we rely on to run all things online. So my thoughts are around that, around the need of global consensus and public policy at the highest level to get that fixed, and also funding, because public funding, I don't think something like should be supported like by consumers, or something like Tor should only be supported by a government that can flip sides. So those are my initial thoughts, and I'm happy to that my connection is not ideal, so I will keep it brief. Yeah.
I mean, thank you, Renata. I mean, I think we've seen a lot of the privacy enhancing technologies that a lot of individuals and maybe even social movements were relying on, such as Tor and to some extent Signal, have recently been defunded by the Trump administration's takeover of the Open Technology Fund. So it's not clear when and if that would ever be fixed. At the same point, ultimately, I think the point that we're trying to make here is the internet. When
Sorry to interrupt you.
When the Stone Revelations first happened, the internet was viewed as a kind of force for good. WikiLeaks was a force for good. People were using it to organize politically. And now it's also clearly a force for economic domination and control. And that's a kind of change of strategy. And how do we react? And so do you have any more thoughts on that, Renata? Is there any kind of particular things?
Yes, I have thoughts on that, because it was never. I think it's a very naive approach, and we were very we were just for idiots, believing this narrative of internet for good, internet for development, internet for democracy, and for media diversity. I mean, it was very naive from many of our communities to believe that that was the goal, the ultimate goal of someone controlling all the pipelines, standards, and industry. I think that, but I think that it can be undone, and of course, decentralization is at the core of it, and autonomy is also at the core of it, and it's still not too late. And if you think that half of the global population is still offline, we have a moral duty as progressives, and a responsibility on how are we going to connect the next billion. And I know that it is not the most attractive part of the market, maybe, but it's where the efforts are, and where the things could be like shifted. And I think that this crisis that we are still in the middle of, especially in the global south, invites a lot of reflection, and hopefully through the progressive international, a lot of action directed to mobilize globally all the progressive forces to take back our tech as a public good and human right. Yeah. And I don't know if you heard.
And I'd like to just ask another question. Going back to the initial blog post that started this session. Oh, I think. Okay. Okay. Sorry, I think everyone's internet connection is a bit shaky, but I'd like to address this question to the whole audience, maybe Roberto first, and then Ines. What do you think of what's happening now with digital financial?
Sorry, Harry, I didn't hear the whole question.
Yeah, you were cut. Harry, are you still there? I think he's reconnecting.
I'll ask question to Alexei the
Yeah.
meanwhile. So as I work with, as I am PhD student of Claudia, and I know Harry very much, I'd like to ask a question. What do you think the problem of putting on at a large scale a privacy enhancing technology? Is it going to be a usability problem, or is it going to be accessibility, or like what do you think? What do you think is the main challenge of developing a technology and being used at a large scale? On a large scale.
Yeah, I think the critical point is education, because you just look at. I mean, I have 2 kids, and I just see how they use the tools, you know, and that this is a good way. And I see that in school, they today you learn how to use some tools which people think are useful for. In the business world, so you learn Word, Excel, how to use internet browser. That's not how you become a free minded person who's autonomous on the world. You need to learn some of the more concrete tools, and it's not just about learning how to code, because that was like one thing. It was the first time we tried to express something, but it's not about learning how to code. It's more learning how to manage your life. So learning what is your digital footprint, how does it work, learning how to sign electronically, what is applied cryptography. And in reality, even if you're a kid, even a 10 years old kid can know this, can learn about signing a document electronically, because you already learn it. You already learn it for when you do normal signing, you know, like paper signing. So you can do it. And this is the biggest hurdle will be to create those programs in schools to learn those people to be free, to be emancipated and responsible digital citizens. And that takes generations, several generations, for us to try to push, and then the next generation a little bit more. And then at one point we will have a real program with people which have, when you're a kid and you're naturally born and raised into a society that emancipate you as a digital citizen.
Okay, thank you so much. Do we have Harry back?
Yeah, I'm sorry, everyone. Me and Renata are in and out. So I'd like to ask a question to Roberto. What do you, given, you know, a lot of people, for example, our, you know, co-founder George Denises, we're working on privacy technologies, but you know, as Ines pointed up, the sort of large money shows up from big companies. They're technically skilled individuals. So like many other people, you know, George went off and joined Facebook Libra. What do you think is the danger? And we saw the same thing with the open source movement, Microsoft, for example, buying GitHub. How do you think radical or revolutionary social movements or human rights activists or whoever, Bitcoin advocates, can prevent their technologies and their kind of social forms from being co-opted by things like Microsoft or Facebook, Libra, which are essentially, you know, are tools of U.S. Jurisdictional domination? Do you have any thoughts on that, Roberto?
Yeah, a lot. Like it's very sad that we see so many young talents go in and work into those companies in a small box, wasting their lives just to close an agreement of consulting to pay big hours into some, you know, as we see in Brazil a lot, government's RFQ, right, request for quoting. And I see first Bitcoin, and now we know that we have the foundation of what would become money to us into this digital world, an opt-out, as I've said. This thing pushed up more money into cryptography. And in one way, if we have a too like NEM and like Bitcoin, and we have a lot of people interested in supporting it, we could do as a group, as Inez said. And I think those are the engineer groups. I mean, if we look at Bitcoin, the first ones that mined it, they were more close to engineering than anyone else, right? And I think we are living in a very particular complicated situation now, especially as you mentioned, George, and there is a lot of other people, and there is also a lot of people that wrote things as Bitcoin and etc. that they don't have money to support themselves nowadays. So it's very complicated because this seems for me something like the dog with two fathers, right? With two owners. So one is going to think, look, somebody's going to feed the dog. And in the end, nobody feed the dog. And this is the threat, because we are kind of start having mature tools like NEM, Mixed Network, the second most exciting project to me in 20 years, maybe, Bitcoin and NEM. And we've been working with it. And the thing is, people that have at least one reasoning about their privacy, and if you have kids, you should support, find ways to support, find a programmer and help. I think this is the way we can fight back. And it's very hard because governments is hiding, they are hiding people, they are messing up with laws that they still are trying to push laws that prohibit usage of cryptography. So it's a very complicated kind of war, right?
And that's why I'm just taking jumping on this. That's why the right of using cryptography should be enforced, and there should be always a right to use cryptography, and this right needs to be protected in a way that is understood. And if you understand that today we ask for to use cryptography, and what people see in the traditional societies that cryptography is used by criminals. So we need to come to the understanding, to a social understanding, that cryptography is used to protect our digital self and to protect our autonomy, the way we are capable of making our own choices. Once we do this, we understand that cryptography is something good. And what is interesting is that I'm in Switzerland, and I rush into Bitcoin professionally since a few years ago, because it was the first time that we could use cryptography for something completely different. It was to make money. And I knew that in Switzerland, as soon as you talk about money, people are like listening. They're like, oh no, this is serious. Now it's business, it's serious. Before, cryptography was only for like hackers and criminals and whatever. So I think we have a great chance to mix also like business opportunity and privacy, and we can have great value when people are free and autonomous.
So now I think we're coming to the close of the panel. I want to give all the panelists, brief final statements. I'm just going to summarize at least what I've learned. It seems to me that we do have this looming problem of cybercolonialism, perhaps better phrase is cyber imperialism, the sort of control of countries by advanced global capitalist powers, not just the United States, but a sort of global surveillance apparatus, and that the attempts to create alternatives is still has changed since 2013 and 14. Now we have both greater interest in financial technology, such as Bitcoin and blockchains, a much more nuanced understanding of rights, a much more better political understanding of how the internet can be used as a form of economic exploitation control, but also, as Ines, I think, rightfully pointed out, now technical workers, programmers are now the kind of vanguard of politics. They're the most important people in terms of the ability to create these new technologies, but they're mostly creating them for companies like Facebook or Microsoft, and not, as Alexi put it, to educate their children, to liberate their own nations, and to emancipate themselves. And that is a problem. So it's a problem that I would like people to think about and address in their final statements to the audience. And if there's any final questions, do type them because we may have a few minutes left to answer. So let's go around, maybe the order we start in. Roberta, if you have any final thoughts.
No, I think everyone should find something that preserves our rights and start working towards it, because the clock is ticking.
Ines?
I think for me, it's really important to remember that humans are only free when they have their own privacy. I do work in anonymous communication, and of course, the question we get asked a lot, I'm sure it's Harry and Alexi and Roberto, oh, Bitcoin is going to use by criminal. It is true, but the solution is not that we're going to all be surveilled and monitored into doing like the right thing, because otherwise, even if you're doing all the right things by all the standards, by all the laws, you're not going to be a free human being, and therefore we need to all push for our right to have private lives.
Alexi, we do have 2 or 3 minutes, so feel free to expound.
Thank you. I think the where I want to take people on board with me is that a few years ago, when I was already trying to find out how to embrace this world, it was hard. You know, it was hard because we were all alone, trying to see how we can decentralize our file system, use open source software, have decentralized and privacy-friendly communication system, and basically you were all alone in a small space, and it was very hard to communicate with anyone. Now it's getting better. It's still hard to communicate with your own family. You still have to use Facebook and WhatsApp to do so, but at least the community is getting bigger, and now there's an actual economy, there is businesses, there are jobs. We are building a whole new society, and we see that appearing. I think this is what changed in the last 5 years, thanks to Bitcoin. And we see that we can create new models of society or alternatives of a digital humanistic society. I don't know how it will look like. It will be post-democratic for some in a certain way. It will be based on the rules that Bitcoin is showing us the way, with consensus-based, with network effects and things like this. But at least we have an alternative, and now people can embrace this and can join in and create a job and get a job in there. So I'm just calling everyone who's listening here. If you are in a position where, if you're in a company, you can go this direction, push this company this direction, or you can find a job in this. So it's something now you can actually start making a living out of it. It's still small, but you can do, and you can actually embrace these new societies. So I'm just calling everyone to jump in the game.
Okay, and so I think I'm going to close out now. We are at the end of our hour, but I would say that that was all very inspirational. Thank you so much for coming, Ines, Roberto, Renata, and of course, Alexi. And I do feel that even though the issue of, our kind of naive approach to digital revolution and that somehow freedom would spread with the internet was perhaps an illusion of US global soft power. But now with the collapse of that particular agenda, let's say, perhaps the death of the Open Tech Fund was one of the death knells of that moment. And also we now see in perhaps alternative sources of both funding with Bitcoin and other cryptocurrencies, different forms of autonomy, and new forms of technology such as privacy and mixed nets. And hopefully this all can be used as tools for liberation all over the world. And I do believe very firmly that liberation will not come from the global north, but will come from places, Mexico, Kurdistan, Africa, and other places in the global south, which are both probably feeling the brunt of the economic crisis brought on by Corona worse, but also hopefully able to harness the creativity and the courage of their populations to build new forms of digital technology. And I think the main question, which we may have to wait till next year to answer, is how we can genuinely, we have lots of interesting people in all sorts of different parts of the world and chat channels, watching videos, now very much physically isolated from each other, which most of the world has been for a very long time due to, of course, passport controls. And now the whole world feels this. And I guess the question is how in this new digital era where it's harder and harder to meet physically, and we now have more and more reliance on the internet, how can we build a new form of international solidarity and internationalism against the large platform powers based on these new forms of decentralized technology, but also decentralized social and democratic governance. So that will unfortunately have to wait till next time. And thanks so much for coming. Do feel free to reach out to any of us. We all have Rightscon's profiles and would be happy to chat at any time. Thanks so much for coming. Take care.